Do you know if your paragraphs are doing their job? Today, we're going to make sure that they actually are. A little while ago, we talked about how it's important to figure out what your paper is going to do and not just what it's going to say. And that's because no matter how interesting your paper might be, if it's supposed to persuade someone and then doesn't, well, then it's not a very successful paper. So you want to make sure that your paper is doing its job. But in addition to that, it's also important to ensure that each section of your paper is also doing its part to support the overall purpose of your project. Sometimes it can be easy to get lost in the details of an individual paragraph and forget about what it's supposed to do when you're busy figuring out what you need to say. And of course, we don't want that to happen, so let's get right into talking about how you can ensure that each paragraph in your paper is pulling its weight. To get a better idea of what I mean when I say that each part of your paper should be doing its job to support the overall purpose of the paper itself, I think it'll be helpful to look at the standard outline for a research article. Research articles overall have a very clear purpose. Independent of what an individual article says, they all have the same job of reporting on new knowledge and explaining where it came from. So in order for that to happen, each section of a research article has a very specific job of its own to do. Just about every article will start with an introduction, and every introduction will say different things, but they will also do essentially the same job. That involves providing some context in order to explain why the research needed to be done, usually by pointing out what we already know about a subject and what we don't know yet. The introduction poses the question that the researcher is trying to answer. After an introduction, we get a method section, and again, depending on the experiment, different method sections will say different things, but they will all explain how the research was conducted. Where the introduction poses a question, the method section explains how the researcher started looking for an answer. And then we get results. This is where the researcher reports on their findings and presents the data they gathered through their research method. The results section is a common place to find charts and tables because those are good ways to accomplish the task of showing what the researcher found. Fourth, we get analysis, which is a section that has the job of making sense of the raw data, or of telling readers what patterns, trends, or insights there are to be found in the results. This is often where you'll see statistical formulas and all that stuff, because those are valuable tools for interpreting results and helping readers to make sense of them. And finally comes the discussion section. This is where the writer does the job of telling readers why the results matter and what their implications are, either in terms of further research or in terms of applications of the knowledge. Now that the researcher has found their answer, they use the discussion section to answer the question, so what? Showing their readers the value of what they discovered. As we look at this outline, we can begin to see how each section has a specific job to do, and each section's purpose contributes to what the overall paper is doing. See, if our whole job is to report on a discovery and where it came from, then it makes a lot of sense to start by telling your readers why you were doing research in the first place, how you went about doing that research, and then telling them what you found, what it means, and why it matters. If we took out the method section, for example, a reader wouldn't know how the researcher arrived at their answer. And if one of the primary purposes of the research article is to explain where the knowledge came from, then leaving out the method section would mean that the paper can't do its overall job. So someone writing a formal research article can rely on an outline like this one to know each of the steps they need to accomplish in order to achieve the overall goal of the paper. That way, instead of worrying about what they're going to say, they can just focus on what each section needs to do and then include the stuff that matches each respective purpose. Okay, so the standard outline for a research article can be really helpful to researchers who are trying to figure out what their papers need to do, but what if you're not writing a lab report? Well, luckily, even if this exact outline doesn't work for your paper, we can still apply the same principles to ensure greater success in your own work. In essence, we can begin with the overall purpose of the paper and then reverse engineer a set of steps that you'll need to accomplish in order to achieve your goal. For example, I once had a student who was writing a persuasive essay, but it wasn't quite doing its job. They'd received some feedback that the paper was repetitive and not very engaging, so they came to me and asked what they needed to do. Now, to be clear, this student was an accomplished writer. They had solid scholarly sources, stylish, effective sentences, and a clear sense of what they wanted to persuade their audience to do. Every paragraph in that paper said something different and interesting, but it did feel kind of repetitive. And that's because even though each paragraph was saying something different, they were all doing more or less the same thing. They were telling readers a bunch of facts and statistics about why the writer's position was probably good. So part of the challenge for that student was to figure out not what they needed to say, but what each part of their paper needed to do. Luckily, because their paper had an overall job to accomplish, that of persuading an audience, it was fairly easy to work backwards and figure out what each section of the paper needed to do in turn. So if we were trying to persuade someone, where would we start? Well, we'd probably want to convince them right away that there was, in fact, a problem with the way things were, and then get them to see how they were affected by that problem. From there, we might want to propose our solution and tell them what we thought needed to happen. That would make it necessary for us to show our readers why we thought our solution would work, based on information from our sources and other things that people have tried. And then it would make sense to show them how to implement our proposal. So not just telling them what to do, but showing them how to do it. Add a brief introduction and a conclusion, and we'd have an outline for a paper where each section does a specific, useful job that supports the overall persuasive goal of the paper itself. If you want to successfully persuade someone to do something, these are probably the steps you'd want to take. With that plan, the student was able to transform their paper. It was no longer a tedious string of paragraphs that all said why the writer was correct. Instead, it became an effective, purposeful argument that actually had a pretty good shot at persuading its audience to do something. And it's all because the writer had a good sense of their overall purpose, and they let that inform the supporting purposes of the smaller sections of their paper. So again, it can be tricky to figure out what you're going to say in a paper, and it gets especially perilous when your search for what to say distracts you from what you're actually supposed to be doing. But if you can keep your focus on the job to be done, then it becomes relatively easy to reverse engineer an action-oriented plan for your paper. Just ask yourself, whatever your ultimate goal is, what steps do you need to lead your reader through in order to get them where you need them to be? If you're writing a research article, then walking your readers through the steps of an introduction, methods, results, analysis, and discussion sections will probably serve you well about 100% of the time. Similarly, if you're writing a persuasive paper, then the plan we just discussed could be really useful for you. Establish the problem, propose your solution, explain why you know it will work, and then show your audience how to carry it out. If each section of your paper does its part, then you can have a lot of confidence that your paper will do what you want it to do. Plus, this is especially handy because it can help you to understand what you don't need to say in your paper. Maybe something is funny or interesting or surprising, but if it doesn't help your paper to do what it needs to do, then it probably doesn't need to be in your paper. It's a lot easier to revise and to cut things out if you're thinking about what you need to do and not just all of the things that you could say. I mean, ultimately you can say whatever you want, but if it's not going to help you to accomplish your purpose, then it's probably better to leave it out. So that's all there is to it. If you're trying to figure out what each section of your paper needs to do, take your overall goal, break it down into smaller steps, and then walk your reader through those steps until they arrive at your ultimate goal. Do that, and you'll be writing powerful papers in no time at all. So I suppose I'll leave you to it, and we'll talk again soon.